I want to express my very deep appreciation to ICNC and to the Fletcher School Summer Institute for inviting me for the fifth time in a row, fifth year in a row, to be a part of this evening. And I certainly agree with Bill and with Jack that this can be for many of you a momentous time in your lives, and that it can help you see the infinite possibilities that the human family has to move beyond its rage, its anger, its need to be dominating, and to use some of the best wisdom that we of the human race have created across, what, 1 million years? 500,000 years? How many years? That there is in our past value systems and wisdom and ways of accomplishing change in which we do not need to keep going on around the cycles of war and violence, of hatred, division, splitting people up into pieces, that there can be a common vision, that we can have a better kind of world, that we can write history with new themes and with new power. And that is certainly a part of the business of many of us here in this room, continuing to teach and push nonviolent methodology, nonviolent philosophy, nonviolent tactics and strategies. Our earth desperately needs it. I want to also just simply say a word about Jack Duvall and Peter Ackerman, how I wish that in 1958 we had a far more powerful book and film. But such resources were not around in the 50s or the 60s or even in the 70s. And some of us who were practitioners of nonviolent strategy had to pull things together from many, many different sources, but it has to be said that for me at least, the Gandhian experiment of more than 50 years was a major source of my recognizing that what I was doing as a person, as a young person, as early as in high school and elementary school, on the issues of racism and prejudice in the United States, personally, was in fact the way to go, the way to create change. And Gandhi helped me to recognize that, so much so that I experienced the issue that he faced in South Africa as he was exploring terms like passive resistance and pacifism and so forth and so on. He felt there was no term that was adequate to explain the 1906 campaign or 1907 campaigns in South Africa, and so invented this term nonviolence. I, as a freshman in college, gave up the term pacifism as an adequate description at all of what I felt I wanted to do and what we needed to try to do in our own country. So I want to express my deep appreciation for both the book and the film, and in courses that I teach at Vanderbilt University, UCLA, USC, and other places. I've used this book in the film set in the last 10 years to teach. It's a great, great, great resource for us, and I surely commend it to all of you. Now I want to very briefly simply talk about, in a way, the power of nonviolence and the power of struggle and nonviolent conflict through nonviolent understanding. And I would begin by lifting up to you a date that most of you will not know anything about. That's the date of December the 6th, 1955. December 6, 1955. That was the date when many people in the world learned of the beginning of the Montgomery bus boycott in Montgomery, Alabama. A very simple stroke. It was not initially called a nonviolent movement, but Rosa Parks and Ed Nixon and Mary Jo Robinson and Martin King and Ralph Abernathy and a host of other people who engaged that first effort sent a wave of hope around the world. I learned of it in Nagpur, India, on December the 6th. It was on the front pages of the papers of India, on the radio. It was on front pages in Africa and Latin America and Asia alike. That in this nation of the United States, the wealthiest, most powerful nation that our human history knows anything about, a simple business of a bus boycott began. It sent waves of hope and aspirations around the world. We today may not understand that. It was a boycott that lasted 381 days, where approximately 40 to 50,000 black people stayed off the buses. And many of those people, the children, the young people, the students, many of them decided, I'm not going to ride any bus. I'm going to walk everywhere. And they did so 381 days. It was only after the first weeks that persons began to talk about mass direct action and began to use the term nonviolence. December the 5th, that term was not used, nor were the theories of Gandhi's talked about to any extent. I'm not sure why that was so in the light of some of the things that have been written. But it was only a few weeks after that began that the term nonviolent struggle was used for the first time. But the point of that story is to say to you that it caused a major shift in the world concerning the possibilities of the 20th century to create change. And it brought to the foreground in the United States and in the Western world the term that Gandhi had invented, nonviolent struggle, nonviolent struggle, which in my mind was a part of the importance of it. Now, after that Montgomery bus boycott, a major issue for Dr. King and a number of different people was what's next. It happened here, Montgomery. Can it work? Will it work again? It is into that scene then that I moved to Nashville, Tennessee, and became a troubleshooter for the Fellowship of Reconciliation. This meant, among other things, that I traveled extensively around the South. I gave the Little Rock Nine in Little Rock, Arkansas, their first workshop on how you resist this evil that you're facing in Central High School without imitating it. They were told not to fight back. And I said, well, your parents and the NAACP and others do not mean do not fight back. They mean do not fight back with the same anger and rage and tactics and epithets of the students and the White Citizens Council who are trying to drive you out. Find other weapons. Discover your courage and your character. Find the weapons of turning the other cheek. Find how you can fight the assault upon yourselves with weapons that involve the intellect, the imagination. In a very rough scene. I can't describe to any of you that scenery at all because you do not have the context for understanding the United States at that time, and especially the South, and especially the issue of segregation and the rest of it. But they caught essentially daily warfare in the school, these 9 young people. Daily warfare. Well, how do you battle that and do your studies and continue to try to work on your own goals? Well, I became a troubleshooter. In the bombings of Birmingham in 58, 59, 60, 61, 62, 63, I was in Birmingham all the time to talk to Martin King about the bombing, to report to some of our allies in other parts of the country about what these bombs meant. So a big question was, it worked once, can it work again, and where will this happen, and how does this happen, and what's the issue that will allow it to be an effective weapon for change? And it so happened that in Nashville at that time, there were a variety of people who thought the bus boycott was an extraordinary event and who thought we ought to try to do something in Nashville. A bus boycott they didn't need to do in Nashville by that time. So we began to talk among ourselves about what can we do. And as Fellowship of Reconciliation Southern Secretary, I made the decision to make Nashville an experimental effort to see if we could conjure up a movement and a struggle. And I used 2 initial steps of Gandhi that I had learned from Gandhi's methodology to start it. The first step was to pull people together, and they came from different walks of life, for what Gandhi would call investigation or for focus. Examine the dimensions of the issue, and examine them carefully, investigate them carefully, become highly informed, and out of that, then analyze the situation and see where you can begin and what must be done. There's a lot about that that's so very, very important. It is actually, as I look back upon it, it is, in fact, the scientific principle. It is bringing to bear on a social political scene reason, making certain that you have some idea of what's going on in your scene, and that you become, in fact, better informed upon it than probably all the people of power. And so we pulled together 6 months of weekly meetings in which we explored the plight of the Negro in Nashville. And we assessed a huge list of difficulties and issues. And then we spent about 3 months saying, where do we want to try to begin? And it was the women in these weekly meetings that convinced me and others that we should start downtown, in downtown Nashville. That was the place to begin. Now, there are reasons for this. Segregation is a spiritual and moral issue. It denigrates people. It says that some human beings are not human, and it says, among other things, other human beings are superior humans. It's a spiritual, psychological, moral poison that my country suffers from immensely, because we, even today, do not understand it and cannot figure it out. What was poison about downtown Nashville is that it was the major shopping center for most families at that time in 1959. Even the major grocery stores were downtown. We did not have shopping malls like we do now in many cities. And downtown was a hazard for black people. You had the signs, white only, colored only, over drinking fountains. You had restrooms that were divided up into white ladies, white gentlemen, and then maybe colored. In addition to that, the women in those workshops in '59 said, you men really don't know very much about downtown Nashville. We have to shop there. There is no place where we can sit down and rest our feet if we are shopping with our children. Not only do we have these horrible signs, but when we shop with our children, we can't buy a pair of shoes having tried them on the feet of our boy or girl to see if the shoe would fit. If you wanted to buy a hat, you couldn't try the hat on. You could not try a dress on before you purchased it. Then in addition to that, it was a gauntlet. You were always being mistreated. You didn't know at what point when you would be insulted or you would have a hostile incident occurred to you. So it was based upon their analysis that I recognized we should go downtown and we should do something about it. So it was an issue of dignity, it was an issue of jobs, it was an issue of service, it was the issue of pulling those signs down. Now, I want to say something about the United States at this point that's important, because in that day and age, these signs, white, colored only, were a vast array of signs. And I do not understand why many of the books that review this period never really talk about this. But there were signs in America that said, in a restaurant, a skating rink, no Jew allowed here. In some parts of the country, it was no Mexican, no Chinese, no WAP, no dirty Irish. So it was not just white and colored signs. Those were the major signs in the southeastern and south central section of our country. And that was the major custom, white and black. But it affected all kinds of people. And one of the points I want to drive home is that with those signs, there was no shame in the United States about such signs that I can figure out. There was no shame. The victims of the sign, whether an Indian in North Dakota or a Mexican-American in southwest Texas, felt the assault of it. The Negro felt the assault of this. But basically, they were there by custom or they were there by law without the nation objecting to it, without any political campaigns against them, to either end the law, end the custom, end the practice. And so when we talked about these matters in Nashville, we were the only place in the country where such talk went on, addressing the issue of how so often repression in every form and any form is an assault upon the dignity of the people. It seems to me that poison is what we need to often talk about. In any case, with that in mind, we started a strategy and a plan to begin to deal with it in Nashville. And we recruited people across the summer of 1959 and prepared 3-4 months of workshops and training, some of which you saw here, that was directed at the part of the first step that Gandhi proposed, the first methodological step, that you not only investigate, but as you make a choice about where you need to work, you have to begin to recruit people and train people and prepare people for the many aspects of the struggle that they will have to face. You try to help them develop a philosophy for action, a philosophy that will allow them to discover the strength that is in them as a human being, to empower them, as well as then prepare a political social strategy that will make an assault on the issue and change that issue. So that was the step that we took in doing workshops and preparing our people extremely well for the ensuing action. We had a very simple plan to use the sit-in. I chose the sit-in. That's a factor I did not learn from Gandhi, as a technique I did not learn from Gandhi. We did not have Gene Sharp's book on the 194 techniques that people had used across the written histories. But we did have in the United States the use of the sit-in in restaurants and skating rinks as early as 1942 in Chicago and Los Angeles and a number of places. And I had read about these things in college, and then I had tried to use those things myself in being rejected service, rejection in a hotel, rejection in a counter, a restaurant, even in my own hometown in Ohio. I did begin learning how to sit in personally, and then with one or two friends, we experimented with the sit-in. So it was from that then that I proposed that first we start a sit-in, but we be prepared to move to picket walks, poster walks, to economic boycott, the mass meetings, the community mobilization, civil disobedience being a part of a major strategy as a technique of nonviolence, as one of the weapons of nonviolence. So we outlined that sort of program and strategy for Nashville, and as you can see from the film, it did work. Nashville became the first city in the South where the signs began to come down. Restroom renovations took place, waiting rooms changed, where in the negotiations with the merchants, we had them begin to retrain their people in their stores to treat every person with dignity. We helped them to start the process of pulling down the signs and renovating their places of business. And negotiations then convinced the merchants that it could be done quietly by a plan that we had devised in our Central Committee. I want to then add just one other word, and that is this. As the film suggests, the movement out of Nashville basically reinvented the struggle of black people in the United States in the 50s and 60s about how to make changes in the direction of justice, equality, and liberty for all. We reinvented that struggle in very serious ways. So it was not just the Montgomery bus boycott, but certainly the Nashville movement. The film describes a little of that with the numbers of people that we were able to train who went on to work. I myself became nonviolent educator for the Southern Christian Leadership Conference in September of 1960. It was a volunteer job. It was not a paid staff job of any kind. And it helped me, therefore, to help shape SCLC and Martin King and the movement there. Bernard Lafayette went into the American Friends Service Committee. We in Nashville were a major force to organize the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee that became in some ways the sort of a vanguard group in some of the actions of the movement in the 60s rather. A number of people became persons with Congress of Racial Equality, Southern Christian Leadership Conference, and as the film suggests, for the next decade. But when I say we reinvented the struggle, I want to add then another piece of this. Because the 1960 sit-in campaign became a national campaign, it went into every state of the Union. with sympathetic organizations and student groups across the country organizing the support, but then organizing what they needed to begin to do in their own community, on their own campuses. That went on for at least another decade or so. So I tend to see the civil rights movement not as a one-year thing, but I insist from 1953 to 1973, a 20-year period in which again and again there were major enterprises of action that helped to shake the status quo and to put on the agenda of governors and the state legislatures and the presidents an agenda apart from going to war to Vietnam and so forth and so on, a different agenda. But there was a serious challenge the very next year after 1960. That challenge was the Congress of Racial Equality, one of the organized organizations that worked to apply nonviolent techniques to issues of racism and so forth. They started what was called the Freedom Ride that on May 4th began to move down the East Coast to test bus travel. Hospitality is a major issue of sexism and racism and violence. It's a major issue. The hospitality that includes people rather than exclude. And when that ride of 16 people that included John Lewis, who was in this film as well, and James Farmer, who became president of Congress of Racial Equality, a number of other people, met great violence planned by the police, if not the FBI, and planned by the white citizens' councils of Alabama, and planned by the Ku Klux Klan, all two of those institutions, a major effort to perpetuate white supremacy and Jim Crow law and racism as an ideology and as a form of repression in the United States. A bus burning in Anniston, Alabama, and then when those riders reached Birmingham, Alabama, they met a white mob that was encouraged by the police. That was made up of white citizens' council and Ku Klux Klan people, and any number of the folk were severely beaten in Birmingham. And the 13 people who reached Birmingham were so demoralized that they voted not to continue the ride. In Nashville, we had strategized that when the opponents use a major assault against your legitimate movement, then you have to take some time to do the strategizing that allows you to handle that major resistance moment, do something about it. You must not allow the opponent to legitimize stopping you by violence. That was the simple point. And so our Nashville group, as we saw the 13 riders decide not to go further, we decided in hectic sessions, basically, that we would take up the ride as a Nashville movement, and we called ourselves the Nashville Movement at that time. And we agreed that we would, through our central committee, which was our major structure for strategy and strategizing and planning, that we would pick up the ride, that we would begin to recruit in Nashville people to go to Birmingham initially, and take the bus from Birmingham to Montgomery, where there was another massive assault by the police and others upon our group, all of whom were from Nashville. Then in Montgomery, another group of us arrived in Montgomery to take the bus from Montgomery to Jackson, Mississippi, where we were all arrested. But our theme was that to work for human rights and human dignity is the responsibility of citizens of the United States, and black people must commit themselves to doing direct action to make the changes we need. Now, and so the Nashville movement, we had, in fact, asked Diane Nash, who by this time had become a coordinator for our movement in Nashville, to call the Attorney General Robert Kennedy, to call Martin Luther King Jr., to call James Farmer, and tell each of them that our Nashville movement was going to continue the Bus the Freedom Ride. There's some interesting stories there, but in any case, the point was that as a consequence then, what could have become a crisis and any further action, direct action, became instead a moment where there was great rallying around the Freedom Ride, and eventually some 400 of us ended up in jails and penitentiary in Mississippi. And that meant that instead of getting out of demonstrations, we escalated a major movement that became a massive campaign. It became the kind of massive campaign that the John F. Kennedy administration then decided we can't afford it internationally. We have to get this out of the front pages. That did not succeed. He used it as a political device. It hurts us in our quest against communism, which in my judgment was a kind of a false war anyway, but the movement succeeded, and so it went on then in 62, a major campaign in 63 and 64, 65 and 66 and 67 and 68 and 69. So campaigns for at least a major decade. In addition to that, Mississippi was a state that was a tyranny organized by the governor and the legislature, the White Citizens Council, by all the senators of the United States from Mississippi and all the Congress people from Mississippi. It was what one author called a closed society. No white or black person could dare question segregation. So the movement had not really begun to take, the movement of direct action had not really begun to take hold in Mississippi. But our going to jail in Mississippi, in Jackson, Mississippi, did two things. One, began to arouse people like Clary Harvey, who was a businesswoman, a black businesswoman in Jackson. It began to arouse her to begin to work for change, which she had done in other ways in the past, but now became much more concentrated. It also caused a movement among black people in Mississippi to begin to see that the direct action dimension had to be taken no matter the cost. But it also caused the Congress of Racial Equality, SNCC, the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, the National Council of Churches, a variety of organizations across the country to decide to place staff people in Mississippi to begin to help that situation gather the possibilities of change. So all through that decade, there were major campaigns with literally hundreds and thousands of demonstrations all across the country that were basically nonviolent direct action campaigns that helped to effect change. The pulling down of the signs and the treating the public with courtesy became a part of the law of the land with the Civil Rights Bill of 1964 as an example. The federal government under Lyndon B. Johnson, the president, said, among other things, that the federal government must help to create a better quality of life for people. Because of the tramping feet of tens of thousands and hundreds of thousands of us in the 60s. And so a variety of platforms of change. We're in turmoil over immigration, while the first immigration bill to desegregate, to deracialize immigration in the United States passed Congress in 1965. as an illustration. So a wide variety of legislation on behalf of the quality of life in the nation emerged in the 1960s and was never passed had it not been for the direct action campaign that in large measure was a nonviolent direct action campaign. And so the final point I would make then is that as I worked in the South and as I worked in Nashville, I have to admit that I did not know what I was doing. I had never applied Gandhian nonviolent methodology to an entire city and to go at the heart of change. But the point I make is because of my study and reading and thinking and all, I was able to creatively help that to happen. Direct work. The military are the perhaps largest institution in the world that which depends on training its people with its history so that they can, in conflict situations, pull out of wars and struggles and battles across the human history strategies and war tactics that enable them to fight in 2010 at various places. Well, we have to do the same thing in terms of nonviolent struggle. Our knowing helps to trigger our imagination when we're in conflictive moments that we need to change. In this film, the first civil disobedience day in Nashville was this February 27th, 1960. And I took the tactic for that day directly out of the Gandhian movement of India. From the Salt March major demonstration, they had a campaign against the British salt-making factory. Gandhi was thrown in jail, so could not lead it. But one of the fine figures in that movement that we don't know about is mentioned in The Force More Powerful, but Sarojini Naidu took over as the chief strategist and organizers of the campaign. And it was very simple. They had some 2,500 people prepared to commit civil disobedience against that salt factory. But all 2,500 were not sent up at one time. They sent them up in waves. And when one wave had been beaten down by the police and were removed from the gates, then a second wave went up. This is described in a number of places, but it wave after wave. In Nashville, as we knew for sure that there would be violence against us and arrest, because we had learned this through our intelligence work. I took that strategic campaign and transposed it to Nashville, so that instead of 300 of us leaving the church to be arrested at the same time, we went in waves. So as Diane explains, when the first wave of people were arrested, let's say at Woolworth's 5 and 10 cent store, we had a second wave of people on the streets, and as soon as the paddy wagons left, that second wave moved in. So we had some 600 people who were ready to be arrested that day, and we did it in waves. It came from my reading of Sarojini Naidu's leadership at the salt factory in India. So this is why it's important for people to gather like you are doing at the FSI today, to learn, to share experiences, but to recognize that if we're going to change the pathology of the world's rush, especially out of the Western world, for power and domination and control through 800 military installations around the world from the United States alone, in 130 countries, from nearly $1 trillion annual military budget. If we're going to get these huge resources turned away from that kind of pathological aspiration to working on the well-being of the human family, we have to have people who see the nonviolent, the struggle for nonviolent change, who are steeped in the past and are activists in the present, so that we can produce a whole different strain of leaders and people in every field of life that will help us make that happen. I personally think that nonviolent struggle offers the earth, the human family, an alternative to the pouring of our resources into the madness that is going on in many parts of our world, including my own country. As an example, the issue in the Middle East of where for 80 years the same stuff has been going on with billions of dollars. Just imagine if that billions of dollars each year were in the business of organizing the Middle East around issues of education and literacy and infant mortality rates and the role of women. Just imagine if that were possible, what a vastly different world we would have today if that same amount of money over the last 80 years, the same numbers of human resources, technological, intellectual resources, had been applied to other methodologies. Just imagine what a vastly different world we would have in the year 2010. So I see what we did in Nashville as one of the examples that can be used and repeated in a great variety of ways. So I urge you to use this summer session as your opportunity to explore the possibilities of nonviolent conflict and struggle in your own world and in your own country. We can have a different kind of world. We need desperately a better world. We need it everywhere across the earth. And I'm convinced that a force more powerful or nonviolent struggle and conflict is that force that can help us create a world of tomorrow that will be vastly different from the world of today. So I'm deeply appreciative of your presence, and I wish you extremely well in these several days that you will have together.
I have a special announcement to make. It's brief. It's a surprise to Jim Lawson, but it's an announcement about something that the International Center on Nonviolent Conflict has decided to begin to do on an annual basis. It requires Jim's permission. It won't begin tonight. Tonight, this is an announcement of something intangible which will become tangible a year from today. But what it is that the International Center on Nonviolent Conflict would like to create on an annual basis what we would like to call, with your permission, the James Lawson Award for Outstanding Achievement in the Study, Communication, or Practice of Nonviolent Conflict, which we would like to give on an annual basis to a single individual who is either an organizer or activist who has demonstrated strategic insight and creativity in waging nonviolent struggle, or a professional, authentic, or citizen journalist whose work has reported in a compelling way on nonviolent conflict, or an educator whose teaching has generated interest, passion, and deeper thinking about the history, theory, and strategy of nonviolent action. And it is our intent to devise a nomination process with Jim's assistance and review nominations, send the word out, review nominations, make a decision, and present the first award a year from tonight, in 2011, with Jim Lawson's cooperation and assistance. Thank you so much.